So what is narcissistic personality disorder? I get asked this a lot by a lot of people that deal with a lot of narcissists in their life, and they asking if they're actually clinically narcissistic, because that's what it is. I'm Dr. Jane, this is Knowing Narcissism, and in this video I wanted to kind of tease out a little bit the differences between NPD, narcissistic personality disorder, and just say narcissistic traits or narcissistic characteristics, or the type of thing that person has in their personality, but they don't quite reach the criteria to be and have that as a diagnosis, because that's what it is. It's a clinical diagnosis. It's part of a suite of personality disorders that is recognised by the DSM and the WHO. And the reason that it is part of that is because we talk about a personality disorder. It's part of your personality. It could come from genetics. It could come from your environment. There's lots of things that make that person who they are. But the reason it's clinical is because you reach the criteria of the personality disorders as set out. And just Google personality disorders if you want some more information. If I could ask you to, even at this early stage, like and subscribe, hit the notification bell, that's great, because it just sends this video out to more people that would be get benefit from it. So what is narcissistic personality disorder? It's a lifelong sense of unbelievable and utter self-importance. Now, when we think of narcissists, and I always say that they're people that think they are special and unique, need to be admired and validated all the time. Narcissistic personality disorder just takes it that one level a little bit higher, and it's that absolute sense of they are the most important person in the world. Now, often people with narcissism, narcissistic personality disorder, it's one of the most clinically recognised disorders going, because often narcissists in the world can just kind of get on with life and they can be very successful. They can get themselves into positions of power. They can be CEOs of companies. They can be politicians. They can be medics. They can get themselves in positions of power because their personality, which, is all part of not having any empathy for other people, just pushes them to that level. And then they get surrounded by people that want to kind of like be in their orbit. That's very common with people with NPD. They will have people sort of like, not just their flying monkeys, their doers and their people that they use. They will just have people around them that just like being in that orbit, because they think a little bit of that success and that bravado and everything that goes with it will rub off on them. So they have a lifelong sense of self-importance. That's the big sort of like global explanation of somebody with NPD. Where does this come from? It can come from, I always say it comes from one of two ways. It can come from that sense of not having things, like you had critical parents, you had poverty, you had that sense, that own sense of feeling inadequate and humiliated. Whereas the difference with the narcissistic personality person, you may have had all of those situations, but you still think that you should have had everything else, not just through comparison. You just believe that it's in your right to have these things. Now, the other way that narcissistic personality comes around, or any narcissism, is through the sense of grandiosity, that sense of you are just the best person in the world and nothing can touch you. And this comes from your formative experience. Not always the mum, it can be both parents, it can be just the dad, but quite often it is a sort of like a mother's influence. They have their own, their little princes and princesses, and nothing that person does, no matter how damaging it might be to other people, is wrong. So their formative experiences are, whatever I do is right. I can't be wrong. And then that develops into the personality that becomes the personality disorder, which, as I said, is not very often clinically diagnosed, because that person tends not to get themselves into criminally difficult situations. Interestingly, when they do, and I've had situations where people have ended up in prison, they then run often to go and get when they, going for the trial, or they're actually in prison. They have a situation where they then get a retrospective diagnosis of NPD in the hope that this may explain their behaviours. And I've had situations where people have been murderers and they have got then a subsequent diagnosis of NPD in the hope that it will explain their behaviours. So when they come up for parole, that is taken into account. And once you get it done clinically, that all then has to go towards that. That's just, what happens. So it's often, unlike other personality disorders like, borderline, etc., or antisocial, it kind of goes under the radar a little bit until it needs to be explained. And we get this, I said that NPD people are often CEOs of companies, and then they get into difficulties. They've behaved inappropriately at a Christmas drinks function, again, thinking about situations I've had. But if I can then quickly run off and get my NPD diagnosis, then that explains it, and then I don't get into trouble, or I get into a smaller amount of trouble. So it's really interesting how the narcissist, it's the one kind of character, part of the personality suite that people will use when they need to, because they believe it kind of gets them literally the get out of jail free card. If we look at the Monopoly thing, they can be quite highly sensitive when it suits them. If they feel that they're being slighted or demeaned in front of others, especially, then that high sensitivity will show itself. But then they can be very blunt on the other hand. If I'm squashing people down to get to the top, then I'm not really kind of taking too much notice of you, and I'm not sensitive to how, because that might affect how I think about myself if I take on your distress and sensitivity. So it's kind of like a bit of a conflict thing there, their sensitivity. Of course, they have no empathy whatsoever. And again, that defines people between narcissistic personality disorder clinically and people with narcissistic traits, that you can be really close. The people with the narcissistic traits can be really, really close to that. But sometimes there is just that flash of understanding and empathy. They don't act on it, but they have it, whereas the NPD people just don't have it in the first place. It's just not within their genetic makeup to have empathy for anybody else or anything else apart from themselves. They just completely lack that ability. So what do you do if you're in some kind of relationship, if you're in a romantic relationship, social work, any family relationship with somebody that either has a clinical diagnosis of NPD, remember, it's my card for excusing my behaviours, or they don't, but you feel that they are. What do you do? First of all, if you can step away from that person, get out of their orbit. They won't like it because they like having people around them. They like having the throngs and the thousands of people around them telling them that they're marvellous and they're right all the time. But if you can get out of that orbit, that will help you tremendously because it gives you clarity of thought. And really, I want to really emphasise, you seek your own help. Now, it might just be looking at videos like this. This is really important. It could be that you actually take professional therapy yourself to unpack the effect that that person has had on you your entire life. It might be a parent, say, for instance. It might be a sibling. Unpack the effect that that has had on you, and then the subsequent effect that it's had on your behaviours and perhaps some of your relationships as well. So have a look at, give yourself that opportunity. I think that's really important. And, it's really, really important. And I just want to emphasise this. Just protect yourself and your family. If you've got children with, if you're in a relationship with somebody with NPD or you suspect has got NPD, just protect your families. Do what you need to do. Make your plans and make sure you keep safe as well. Because, as I said, I have had dealings with people that have been in prison and have clinically then, when they're in prison, got a diagnosis of NPD in the hope that it helps them get out of prison. But the thing is, they still have the NPD, whether they're in prison or out of prison. They still have the narcissistic personality disorder, which is never going to change. And the likelihood of them then getting out might be part of their release and parole conditions that they engage in therapy. But for how long? 10, 15 years down the line, 5 years down the line, a year down the line, they may have finished with that, but they've still got the personality disorders. And the hope is that they learn the techniques and the strategies, and that's all narcissistic people can do. They can they can copy the techniques and the strategies. They never feel it themselves, but in the hope that that would then influence the subsequent relationships they have. NPD people can be very, very dangerous. That just, that absolute belief in themselves and that complete lack of self-esteem. Really important to just recognise that in people. If I could ask you to like, subscribe and to hit the notification bell, that would just be really brilliant. And please come and have a coffee with me another time and keep safe.